Your group has a problem. Not an immediate crisis. Nobody is injured. The food situation is manageable. The shelter is holding. This problem is subtler than that, and in some ways more serious, because it's the kind of problem that never announces itself dramatically. It accumulates quietly, across generations, in ways that are almost impossible to see until the damage is already done. Your group has 23 people. Of those 23, the adults of reproductive age, number 11. Of those 11, several are siblings. Several more are first cousins, close enough genetically speaking that pairing them off would risk offspring carrying 2 copies of whatever genetic vulnerabilities run in the family. When you actually map out the options for new reproductive partnerships inside the group, they are limited in a way that is starting to matter. This isn't a hypothetical problem invented for this video. It's the specific, recurring, existential challenge of small group human life, a challenge every ancient human community that ever existed had to navigate, continuously and carefully, with enough sophistication to avoid the genetic catastrophe that inbreeding can produce in the span of just a few generations. And here's the remarkable part. They navigated it successfully for hundreds of thousands of years, without genetics textbooks, without the concept of a recessive allele, without any formal understanding of the mechanisms by which inbreeding actually causes harm. Ancient humans solved one of evolutionary biology's hardest practical problems, using tools that were behavioral, social, cultural, and instinctive. And the solutions they developed were sophisticated enough to keep our entire species genetically healthy across the whole span of ancient human existence. How? That's exactly what we're about to find out. Let's start with why inbreeding is actually harmful, because understanding the biological problem is essential to appreciating how genuinely impressive the ancient solutions were. Every human being carries, somewhere in their genome, a collection of deleterious recessive alleles, genetic variants that cause harm when present in 2 copies, but are harmless or nearly harmless when only 1 copy is present. The human genome is enormous, and the ordinary process of mutation produces new deleterious variants all the time. Most stay rare in the population because natural selection removes them whenever they're actually expressed. Whenever someone unluckily inherits 2 copies at once. But in any single person, there may be dozens, even hundreds of these variants sitting silently in 1 copy, masked by a functional version of the same gene on the other chromosome. Here's where relatedness becomes dangerous. When 2 closely related individuals reproduce, the probability that their offspring will inherit 2 copies of the same deleterious variant, the same damaged gene from both parents, increases dramatically. First-degree relatives share approximately 50% of their genetic variants. First cousins share approximately 12.5%. That shared variance means the recessive deleterious variants one relative carries are far more likely to be sitting in the other relative too, and therefore far more likely to end up doubled in their offspring. The consequences are well documented. Children of closely related parents show elevated rates of developmental abnormalities, immune system deficiencies, reduced cognitive function in some cases, elevated susceptibility to certain diseases, and reduced overall fitness. In everything from birth weight to reproductive success in adulthood, in small, closed populations where inbreeding persists across multiple generations, these effects compound. The group's overall genetic load climbs, average fitness declines, and the population becomes progressively more vulnerable to exactly the kind of disease or environmental shock that wipes out a genetically compromised group. For ancient human bands, this was never a theoretical concern. It was a practical, existential threat. A group of 20 to 30 individuals, genetically isolated over several generations, would start showing these effects within a remarkably short period, and the archaeological and genetic record backs this up. Isolated ancient populations, island groups, communities trapped behind glacial barriers, populations crushed down to a handful of survivors by catastrophe, all show exactly the genetic signatures of inbreeding that the theory predicts. Ancient humans who failed to manage this problem left fewer descendants. Ancient humans who managed it successfully are the reason any of us are here at all. So let's talk about the biological toolkit first. The instinctive mechanisms evolution built directly into human psychology as a first line of defense against inbreeding. The Westermarck effect is the most important and honestly the most fascinating of these mechanisms. First described by the Finnish philosopher Edvard Westermarck in 1891, it's the observation that humans who live in close physical proximity during the first few years of life develop a specific aversion to sexual contact with one another, an aversion that operates below conscious awareness and is remarkably resistant to conscious override. This is not a rule anyone teaches you. It's an automatic psychological response triggered by one specific developmental experience, shared early childhood in close domestic proximity. The mechanism seems to be calibrated to use the domestic unit as a proxy for genetic relatedness. In the environment it evolved in, whoever shared your living space during early childhood was almost always a close genetic relative, because ancient domestic units were family units. Evolution didn't need to encode a genetic test. It just needed a reliable enough proxy, and who you grew up in a shelter with turned out to be that proxy. The evidence for the Westermarck effect is substantial, and it comes from multiple independent directions. The most famous case comes from the Israeli kibbutz system, where unrelated children raised together in communal peer groups from infancy show the exact same aversion to each other that close biological relatives show. Studies found that despite no cultural prohibition and zero genetic relationship, children raised in the same peer cohort from their first years of life virtually never married each other and openly reported finding each other sexually unappealing. The mechanism fired on the shared childhood experience alone, with no genetic relationship required to trigger it. And here's the flip side, which is just as revealing. Individuals who are closely related but did not share early childhood proximity do not experience this aversion at all. It's called genetic sexual attraction in the psychological literature. The intense, often unwanted attraction that some adults report when they're reunited with close genetic relatives from whom they were separated as children. Put those two findings together and the picture becomes clear. The aversion was never really about genetic relatedness itself. It's about the specific developmental experience of close early childhood proximity. Genetic relatedness was just what that experience reliably predicted, back when the mechanism evolved. For ancient humans, this system was running constantly, in the background, doing its job without anyone noticing. Siblings, half-siblings, close cousins who shared the same family living space, all developed the aversion that kept them from pairing off with each other. No conscious decision-making required. No knowledge of genetics required. No cultural rule required. Just an automatic, instinctive mechanism, precisely calibrated for exactly the problem it needed to solve. But, and this is the catch, the Westermarck effect, while necessary, was never sufficient on its own. It prevents mating between people who shared early childhood proximity. It does nothing to prevent mating between more distant relatives who didn't grow up in the same household. Cousins, second cousins, people related through a parent who left the group years earlier. For a small group of 20 to 30 people, plenty of whom might be related at exactly that level without ever having shared a childhood roof, something more was needed. This is where the social and cultural layer kicks in, and this is where the evidence of ancient human behavioral sophistication gets genuinely impressive. The fundamental behavioral solution to the inbreeding problem in small groups is exogamy, the practice of finding reproductive partners from outside your immediate social group rather than from within it. Exogamy is one of the most universal features of human social organization ever documented in anthropological research. The specific rules for who counts as outside vary enormously across cultures and eras, but the basic principle that reproductive partnerships should form between people from different social units, not within the same one, shows up in essentially every traditional human society studied deeply enough to map its mating rules. Exogamy isn't just a cultural preference, it's a behavioral solution to a biological problem, and ancient humans appear to have developed and maintained it long before agriculture ever existed. The genetic evidence from ancient human remains is one of the most powerful demonstrations of this. Studies of ancient DNA from hunter-gatherer sites across Europe, Asia, and elsewhere consistently show patterns of genetic diversity that are simply incompatible with closed inbreeding populations. The variation present in these ancient communities could only be maintained through ongoing gene flow between groups, the regular introduction of new genetic material from outside the local band through reproductive partnerships. One study of ancient hunter-gatherer genetics from a site in Belgium, dating to roughly 35,000 years ago, found that the individuals buried there carried genetic signatures suggesting the females in the group had come from different genetic populations than the males, consistent with a system where women moved between groups at reproductive age to form partnerships outside their birth group, while men tended to stay put. That's the specific genetic fingerprint of female exogamy, women leaving their natal group to mate with unrelated men elsewhere, or men from other groups traveling in to mate with women in the resident group. Sunghir, in Russia, gives us an even more striking example. It's a burial site roughly 34,000 years old, and when researchers ran the genetics on the individuals buried there, they found something almost nobody expected. These people buried together in the same community were not close relatives. Somewhere out on the freezing Ice Age steppe, a small human community was already reaching well beyond its own walls to find partners. 34,000 years before anyone wrote down a single rule about who you could and couldn't marry. Now, let's talk about the logistical infrastructure behind ancient exogamy, because maintaining outbreeding partnerships between separate small groups required a level of social organization that is both impressive and seriously underappreciated. Outbreeding requires contact. Contact requires relationships. And relationships between separate groups require maintenance, over time, deliberately. The specific mechanisms ancient groups used to maintain the intergroup relationships that made exogamy possible represent some of the most important social technology in ancient human history. Technology built entirely out of behavior, with no written record and no formal institution, just repeated human practice passed down generation after generation. The first mechanism is periodic aggregation, the regular coming together of multiple separate bands into larger gatherings at specific times and places. Evidence for this comes from several directions at once. Archaeological sites show significantly larger than normal occupation during specific seasons, often tied to peak resource availability, like major salmon runs, large game migrations, or seasons of abundant plant food. At these sites, you see the material signature of many groups converging in one place at once. Denser material culture, raw materials sourced from wildly different geographic origins, and evidence of communal feasting at a scale no single band could produce alone. These gatherings were never purely logistical. They were the occasions where intergroup relationships got renewed, alliances got negotiated, disputes got resolved, and, critically, where young people from different groups actually met each other. A young man or woman attending a seasonal aggregation would encounter people their own age from multiple other bands, people they shared no close genetic relationship with, people the Westermarck effect had never touched. This was the ancient marriage market, the social mechanism through which exogamous partnerships actually got formed, face-to-face once a year, at the salmon run or the caribou crossing. Gift exchange and trade networks served a related, equally critical function, maintaining long-distance relationships in the gaps between gatherings. The movement of valued objects across hundreds of kilometers of territory, traceable today through the distribution of specific raw materials at ancient sites, created and sustained exactly the kind of social relationships that made intergroup mating possible in the first place. You don't send your daughter to marry into a group you have no relationship with. You send her to a group your family has been exchanging gifts with for 2 generations, whose members you know by name and by reputation, where the trust already exists to make the arrangement work. Ancient trade wasn't merely economic. It was the physical expression of the social bonds holding separate groups together, bonds that, among other functions, served the crucial genetic purpose of preventing the reproductive isolation that leads straight to inbreeding. Let's talk about kinship systems, because ancient humans developed remarkably sophisticated social structures for organizing and regulating reproductive partnerships in ways that explicitly prevented inbreeding. Kinship terminology, the specific ways different cultures classify relatives, distinguishing who's an appropriate reproductive partner from who isn't, is one of the most extensively studied features of human social organization. And the sheer cross-cultural diversity of these systems, combined with their near-universal concern with blocking reproductive partnerships between specific categories of relatives, tells us something important about how long and how seriously ancient humans took this problem. The most basic universal feature of kinship systems is the incest taboo, the prohibition on sexual contact between specific categories of close relatives. It's one of the most universal features of human culture on record, present in every society ever studied, though with real variation in exactly which relatives fall inside the prohibited category. That kind of universality, in a domain of behavior with such clear biological consequences, is strong evidence of an ancient origin. The incest taboo does more than block the most extreme forms of inbreeding. It's the explicit, culturally transmitted, consciously maintained reinforcement of the Westermarck effect, taking the automatic aversion biology provides and encoding it into cultural rules that extend its reach, spell it out explicitly, and add social enforcement for the cases where the biological mechanism alone might not be enough. Beyond the taboo, many traditional societies went a step further and developed positive marriage rules, rules that specify not just who you can't marry, but who you should marry. The most widespread version of this is cross-cousin marriage, a system where marriage is encouraged, sometimes even prescribed, between a person and their cross-cousins, the children of their mother's brother or their father's sister, while marriage to parallel cousins, the children of their mother's sister or their father's brother, is strictly prohibited. Now, why would any system draw that particular line? Because it maintains ongoing alliance relationships between specific family lines, while still preventing the closer inbreeding that parallel cousin marriage would tend to create, given how these kinship groups were typically structured. To be clear, cross-cousin marriage isn't ideal by modern genetic standards. First cousins still share 12.5% of their genome, and their children carry an elevated risk of inheriting a doubled-up deleterious variant. But in the context of small group ancient life, where the realistic alternative, in the absence of intergroup contact, might have been even closer inbreeding, cross-cousin marriage rules that locked out breeding partnerships into a stable system of ongoing family alliances were a genuinely pragmatic solution to the logistical challenge of keeping exogamous relationships alive across generations. Now, let's talk about the genetic evidence from ancient populations, because this is where the story gets validated in ways that are genuinely remarkable. Ancient DNA studies have now analyzed genetic material from hundreds of ancient individuals, spanning tens of thousands of years of human history, and the findings consistently show patterns of genetic diversity and structure that confirm just how effective these ancient outbreeding practices really were. Studies of Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations across Europe show levels of heterozygosity, the measure of genetic diversity within an individual that are simply inconsistent with an inbred population. Ancient individuals from sites spanning thousands of years of continuous occupation show the ongoing introduction of new genetic material from outside their immediate community, visible in ancestry components that aren't fully shared, even with other members of the same archaeological culture. There's one signature in particular that researchers look for: the genetic fingerprint of female exogamy itself. At a patrilocal site, where men stay and women marry in from elsewhere, mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, should show higher diversity within that site than the Y chromosome, passed down the paternal line. That's exactly the pattern documented at multiple ancient sites, a wide range of maternal lineages converging in one place, next to a comparatively narrow, locally rooted set of paternal lineages. It's the direct genetic fingerprint of a system built to pull in unrelated women from outside groups while the resident men stayed exactly where they were. And the flip side of the evidence is just as telling. The genetic signatures of actual inbreeding, runs of homozygosity, elevated identity by descent between individuals buried at the same site, do show up at some ancient sites, but generally at levels far lower than you'd expect from a closed, reproductively isolated population. When they do spike, it's almost always tied to specific circumstances: island populations, groups boxed in by geography, communities crushed down to a handful of survivors by catastrophe. The general pattern across ancient human populations, everywhere else, is successful management of inbreeding risk through exactly the behavioral and social mechanisms we've just walked through. Ancient humans were not accidentally avoiding inbreeding. They were actively, systematically, and effectively preventing it. Let me talk about something that rarely gets discussed in this context, but that's directly relevant: the role of women in the ancient exogamy system. In many documented traditional societies with exogamous mating patterns, it's women, not men, who move between groups at reproductive age. This is called patrilocal residence. Men remain in their birth community for life, while women leave to join their partner's community. It's one of the most widespread residence patterns in traditional human societies, and the ancient DNA evidence from multiple sites is consistent with this pattern having an extremely long history. What this meant for the individual women involved is profound, and it rarely gets acknowledged. A young woman in an ancient community practicing patrilocal exogamy would, at some point in her teens or early 20s, leave the only community she had ever known, the group of people who had been her entire social world since birth, and move to a different community, sometimes at real geographic distance, to live among people who were not her relatives, in partnership with a man she might have met only at a handful of seasonal gatherings. That transition was enormous. It meant crossing from the familiar into the unfamiliar, from a community where she knew every face and every relationship, into one where she started out as an outsider. It meant building an entire social world from scratch, establishing her place in a new community's social hierarchy, all while navigating the demands of a brand new reproductive partnership at the same time. The social infrastructure ancient communities built to support that transition mattered just as much as the exogamy system itself. The ongoing relationship between the natal community and the new one, keeping the woman connected to her birth family. The gift exchanges that kept that connection alive materially, not just emotionally. The mechanisms by which her natal community stayed invested in her welfare and could step in if something went wrong. Exogamy only works if the women carrying it out are actually supported through the transition, and ancient communities appear to have understood that and built for it in ways sophisticated enough to keep the whole system sustainable across generations. So here's the bottom line, delivered with the weight it deserves. Ancient humans solved one of the hardest problems in small group reproductive biology without a single textbook, without a genetic counselor, and without understanding the molecular mechanisms through which inbreeding causes harm. They solved it using a layered system of biological instinct, behavioral practice, social institution, and cultural rule. A system that together produced enough genetic diversity and reproductive health to sustain our species through hundreds of thousands of years of small group life. The Westermarck effect provided automatic aversion to mating with anyone who shared early childhood proximity. The incest taboo extended that aversion and reinforced it culturally. Periodic intergroup aggregations created the social occasions where outbreeding partnerships could actually form. Long-distance trade and gift exchange maintained the intergroup relationships that made those partnerships possible in the first place. Kinship systems and marriage rules gave explicit guidance about which partnerships were appropriate and which weren't. And female exogamy, paired with patrilocal residence, created exactly the genetic structure the ancient DNA record confirms was actually operating on the ground in real ancient populations. This isn't a simple story of instinct alone overriding a potential problem. It's a multi-layered system, biological and cultural, instinctive and deliberately maintained, showing the same kind of sophisticated multi-generational problem-solving we see in ancient human responses to every other serious survival challenge. Ancient humans understood, in a practical rather than theoretical sense, that reproductive partnerships needed to reach beyond the immediate community. They built social structures to make that possible, and they maintained those structures across generations, because the consequences of letting them lapse were visible and serious every single time. Back to your group of 23 people. The young woman who's been quietly watching the young man from the neighboring group at the last 2 seasonal gatherings, the one from the Valley community, the one whose face she's been thinking about since the autumn meeting. That situation is not accidental. It's the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Her community will facilitate the connection. Both families will exchange gifts. The relationship will be formalized in whatever ceremonial framework this particular community uses for that purpose. The genetic problem gets solved, quietly, the way it always has. Another generation survives with its full genetic health intact. Ancient humans figured this out a very long time ago, long before any of them had a word for what they were actually doing. They did it anyway, and they did it well enough that hundreds of thousands of years later, you exist to watch a video about it.